Prescription for Stronger Canadian Environmental Laws and Policies, and The Optimistic Environmentalist. Both books will be on sale afterwards outside. David will be signing, and I was at a Comic-Con yesterday where Will Enchanter was charging $85 for an autograph, which is an outrage. I can guarantee, I didn't pay it, but never mind, but it's an outrage nevertheless. But I can guarantee that David will not be charging $85 for an autograph afterwards. We will negotiate a good deal with him. He'll draw on both these works in today's talk, and I'm delighted to welcome David Boyd to the college. I would also like to thank McKercher's for the generous sponsorship of the lecture series and the pizza, etc. And again, please welcome David Boyd back to the College of Law.
Well, thanks very much, Martin. It's great to be back here, and I see that pizza is a real draw here at the University of Saskatchewan. So this book, Cleaner, Greener, Healthier, actually had a longer gestation period than an elephant. Its roots date back to 2005 when I was working for Prime Minister Martin as a special advisor on sustainability in Ottawa. And my wife and I, in June of 2005, got the news that we were about to become parents. And there's a few of you in this room who know that becoming a parent is a transformative moment in a person's life. And so that was June of 2005, and that was a tremendously exciting time. And I'd been practicing law for about 15 years by that point, but primarily working on issues related to endangered species, protection of national parks, fisheries, forests, those sorts of things. The idea that I was going to become a father actually turned me 180 degrees, and I started thinking about the human impacts of environmental degradation. And it was less than 2 weeks out after Margot and I found out that we were going to become parents that an American group called the Environmental Working Group put out this really disturbing report in which their scientists sampled the umbilical cord from dozens of newborn American infants and tested that blood for the presence of industrial chemicals. And what they found, to me at least as a prospective parent for the first time, was totally shocking. They found the presence of hundreds of industrial chemicals, flame retardants, plasticizers, pesticides, heavy metals, a real witch's brew of the chemicals that are ubiquitous in today's industrial society. And so I shifted gears and I started working on issues related to human health and the environment. I also went back to school at the University of British Columbia and did a midlife PhD program and took a course with a guy named Dr. Ray Copes, who at the Faculty of Medicine at the University of British Columbia, one of Canada's leading experts in the field of environmental health. And it was a real eye-opener for me. I learned things that I had no clue about. Like, I knew that air pollution was bad for your lungs. I knew that it caused respiratory illness, exacerbated asthma, but I had no idea that air pollution was a major contributor to heart disease, to cardiovascular illness. And I didn't know that radon was one of the, radon is actually kills between 2,000 and 3,000 Canadians a year. And it's the leading cause of lung cancer in people who don't smoke. I also learned that asthma is not only exacerbated by air pollution, but that now there is compelling scientific evidence that air pollution causes the onset of asthma. In Canada, 1 in 12 people suffers from asthma. 1 in 8 children in Canada suffer from asthma. There's also new science emerging on almost like a weekly basis about the connections between environmental degradation and human health. Just in the past 3 or 4 years, there's been a number of studies done that have shown linkages between exposure to certain kinds of pesticides and the onset of Parkinson's disease. And it used to be thought that diseases either had an environmental cause or a genetic cause. Now we're starting to enter a much more sophisticated phase of research. So as I mentioned, not everyone who is exposed to air pollution will develop asthma, but there's people with a certain set of genes that make them more susceptible to developing asthma. So it's gene-environment interactions that are actually probably responsible for the lion's share of these environment-related diseases. How big is this problem? Well, we didn't really have any clue until the year 2006 when the World Health Organization published a breakthrough report on what's called the environmental burden of disease. That's the proportion of deaths and illnesses that are linked in one way or another to an environmental factor. The World Health Organization looked at 85 different categories of disease and found that globally, almost 25% or 1/4 of premature deaths and illnesses have a connection to environmental risk factors, air pollution, contaminants in food and water, toxic chemicals, UV radiation, etc. That's a really big number, one in 4 deaths and diseases worldwide. And of course, there's major differences between wealthy industrialized countries like Canada and developing countries where there's a different set of diseases. Now, I asked Professor Copes, Dr. Ray Copes, I said, well, what's the environmental burden of disease in Canada? And he said, well, that's one of our research priorities, but we haven't actually done the homework yet. So together with Dr. Copes and a doctor from the University of Alberta, I undertook the first Canadian environmental burden of disease study. You're probably wondering why I'm showing a picture of the Saddle Dome here. Well, if you took the Saddle Dome at capacity, that's about 19,000 people. That's a pretty good estimate, in fact, probably on the conservative side, of how many premature deaths in Canada are caused by environmental risk factors in any given year. That's a staggering number of people who are dying prematurely. And that's just a statistic, but it's really important to keep in mind that behind these statistics that I'm throwing out are flesh and blood Canadians, people who have families and loved ones, and so bear that in mind as I'm throwing out numbers at you. So the environmental burden of disease work that we did, we obviously didn't have the resources of the World Health Organization. We just looked at 4 categories of illness: cancer, cardiovascular disease, respiratory illness, and birth defects. Don't turn out the lights, people will go to sleep on me. And for those 4 categories, there's a range of uncertainty, obviously, as to just how many deaths and cases of illness are caused by exposure to environmental risk factors. But we found a range of between 10,000 and 25,000 deaths in those 4 disease categories, between 78,000 and 194,000 hospitalizations, hundreds of thousands of days spent in hospital, millions of restricted activity days for asthma sufferers. And those are big numbers. For a country like Canada, those are disturbing statistics. We also put a price on this, and so I've updated those economic calculations for the new book. And between direct costs, which are costs related to doctor's fees, hospital time, that sort of thing, the environmental burden of disease, just for those 4 categories of illness in Canada, is between $3 and $7 billion a year. The indirect costs, which are calculated based on decreases in productivity from people who are no longer able to work or miss work, between $3 and $8 billion a year. And when you add in the intangible costs, which is the value of lives lost due to premature deaths, then you get a figure that's over $100 billion a year in Canada, a truly shocking figure. So the first thing I did was look at the environmental burden of disease. Second thing was look at how much that's costing Canada every year. And then the third thing I looked at was, well, what's the distribution of these adverse impacts on human health? And of course, they're not fairly or equitably distributed. There's something called the environmental justice movement in the United States, which has been around for close to 40 years now. And this photograph shows people in Warren County, North Carolina, who were protesting the location of a hazardous dump site that was being proposed for their county. 500 people got arrested in 1982 protesting this because they already had 2 hazardous dump sites in their community. And in the United States, there's now piles and piles of evidence that dangerous industrial facilities, hazardous waste dumps, that sort of thing, are disproportionately located in African American, Latin American communities. And so there's actually quite a big body of law that's emerged in the United States in response to that problem, trying to achieve environmental justice. In Canada, the face of environmental injustice is different. It's obviously, it won't come as a surprise to anyone here that it's Aboriginal people who bear the lion's share of environmental injustices in Canada. This picture is taken at the Aamjiwnaang First Nation in Sarnia, Ontario. Small First Nations community surrounded by 25 oil refineries and petrochemical factories. Just basically like a donut. The reserve is the hole in the donut, and they're surrounded by an unbelievable number of industrial facilities. One of the most horrific things I've ever seen. Canadian children should not have to play street hockey in the shadow of an oil refinery. The chemicals coming out of those pipes are dangerous to the development of their lungs and their long-term well-being. This picture is, again, Aboriginal people from Fort Chip, Alberta, living downstream of the tar sands. And there's other environmental injustices in Canada as well. I was really shocked to learn that there are literally tens of thousands of people predominantly living on reserves who don't have access to running water. So they don't have access to safe drinking water. They don't have access to adequate sanitation. These are basic human rights that are being violated on an ongoing basis in Canada. And we're not doing a very good job of remedying these violations of human rights. It goes on, in terms of Aboriginal people, they're disproportionately exposed to environmental hazards such as PCBs, mercury, and you can see that Inuit women have up to 10 times the level of PCBs in their breast milk as women from southern Canada. It's not all about Aboriginal people, though, in Canada. In 2006, the province of Nova Scotia was looking for a new place to put a dump, to put what they call a sanitary landfill. And lo and behold, they decided they were going to put it right beside Lincolnville, Nova Scotia, one of Canada's only predominantly African-Canadian communities. And not all environmental injustices are race-based either. Some of them are based on socioeconomic considerations. So this really shocking study was done by the Canadian Population Health Institute 3 years ago. And they basically divided the Canadian population into 5 quintiles, from poorest to wealthiest, and then overlaid a map of those economic factors with a map of Canada's large industrial polluters from the Canadian National Pollutant Release Inventory. And what they found was 1 in 4 low-income Canadians lives within 1 kilometer of one of these major polluting facilities. And then they also calculated or dug up the data on hospitalizations and found that those people in the lowest quintile are much more likely to be hospitalized for respiratory illness and cardiovascular disease. Environmental justice also includes not just exposure to the bad things, but also access to environmental goods and services and environmental amenities. That same study took again the 5 quintiles based on income and said, what's the proportion of people who live near green space, or the proportion of green spaces near the people? And you can see that the black bars are the poorest people, very little green space in Canada's cities, and the tall bars are the people in wealthy neighborhoods with lots of parks. So that's the first part of the book, which is really examining the magnitude of the problem in Canada, what I call the examination. The second part of the book is the diagnosis, which is really asking why is it that in the year 2015, in such a wealthy, well-educated society as Canada, we still have these environmental health problems of such large magnitude. And so what I did was I delved into the environmental laws of 31 different countries, all the 28 members of the European Union, Australia, the United States, and Canada, and did a comparative analysis of laws in those countries. The first thing I'll say is that Canada is in a minority of countries globally in terms of refusing to recognize that Canadians have the right to live in a healthy environment. It's a human right that's emerged over the last 40 years, and I'll talk a bit more about that later on. Canada is also the only one of the 31 countries that I looked at which does not have a national environmental health action plan. The United States, Australia, and every country in Europe has a plan that's intended to try and address the problems I've been talking about here this afternoon. And so I looked at a lot of different environmental laws, regulations, and policies and compared them across these countries. And what's really profoundly disturbing is that Canada ranked at the bottom of these four areas on every single area that I looked at. So to give a few examples that are concrete, air pollution is probably the single largest contributor to environmental burden of disease in Canada. Canada is the only one of those 31 countries that does not have legally binding national standards for air quality. We have voluntary guidelines at the federal level. Some provinces also have voluntary guidelines. Some have taken those federal guidelines and turned them into law. But we are alone. And you know, countries like the United States and Australia are federal countries as well, but they have legally binding standards that must be complied with or consequences follow. And just to give you one concrete example that kind of puts it in perspective, this is a comparison of air quality rules for sulfur dioxide, which causes various problems related to the respiratory system. Sulfur dioxide is also a component of particulate matter, which is harmful to the cardiovascular system. Canada's national guideline for sulfur dioxide, in terms of what the maximum exposure on an hourly basis, is 334 parts per billion. That's 5 times the American law of 75 parts per billion, and obviously far, far greater than what the World Health Organization says is actually the no observable effects level, that level at which there will be no impact on human health, which is 10 parts per billion. So there's also a whole range of environmental contaminants for which Canada doesn't even have voluntary guidelines, including benzene, which is a known carcinogen. The picture is pretty much the same for drinking water. I looked at 65 different chemical contaminants found found in our drinking water, looked at rules governing bacterial contaminants, radiological contaminants. And for 53 of those 65 chemical contaminants, Canada has a weaker guideline than either the US, Australia, or the European Union. And again, Canada just has national guidelines. We don't have national standards as they do in the United States and the European Union. And in some of these cases, our guidelines are close to, they're weaker than, but close to the standards in other countries. But for example, for one chemical, which is 2,3,4,6 tetrachlorophenol, Canada's guideline is 1,000 times weaker than the European standard. 1,000 times weaker. I mean, it just doesn't make sense that our rules treat Canadians as such second-class citizens. I also looked at the regulation of pesticides. And in Canada, I looked at all of the pesticides that were registered in each of these 4 jurisdictions, the European Union, Australia, the US, and Canada. And Canada allows the use of more than 40 different active ingredients, chemicals that are found in more than 1,000 commercially available pesticide products, which cannot be used in the European Union or Norway because of health and environmental concerns. We're just so far behind in terms of pesticide regulation in this country that it's mind-blowing. And I looked at a whole host of other toxic substances as well, ranging from asbestos and formaldehyde to polybrominated diphenyl ethers, which are flame retardants, perfluorochemicals, better known as stain repellents. And again, Canada's consistently lagging behind the rest of the industrialized world in terms of regulating these substances and protecting our health. Canada, until 2 years ago, was one of the world's leading exporters of asbestos, a substance that the World Health Organization says should not be used in any way, shape, or form because of its carcinogenic or cancer-causing properties. We don't export it anymore because the last company operating in Quebec went bankrupt 2 years ago. We still could export it if we wanted to. And Canada, crazily, imports asbestos for use in things like brake pads for vehicles, for things like construction materials. So at the same time that we as taxpayers are paying tens of millions of dollars to have asbestos removed from the buildings on Parliament Hill, which was taking place when I was working for Prime Minister Martin, we're still importing this material. We're still using it to construct new hospitals and schools, and it just baffles people who are environmental health specialists that Canada's still doing this. More than 50 countries have banned all uses of asbestos. I also looked at climate change laws and regulations. I looked at international commitments, national framework laws, carbon pricing, fuel efficiency regulations, and support for renewable energy. And Canada, again, ranked at the back of the pack in all of those categories. Australia is giving us a run for our money now on climate change, but otherwise we are right at the back of the pack. Oops, I pressed the wrong buttons. Oh, no, I can't find it. Yeah, it's the bottom one. So, I can't see it on here, so. Oh, there we go. All right, thank you. Technical difficulties. And the last area of law and regulation that I looked at was endangered species laws. And again, this is an area where Canada lags behind those other jurisdictions. In addition to laws and regulations, I also want to look at the use of green taxes or environmental taxes. It's another really important policy tool in terms of protecting human health and the environment. So I compared environmental taxes across those countries, again, looking at taxes on pesticides, taxes on air emissions, water discharges, motor vehicle fuels, pesticides, and again, found that in these areas of green taxes, Canada's taxes are either non-existent or lag behind these other countries. So for example, European gas taxes, people complain in Canada about the price of gasoline. European gas taxes are 5 to 12 times, depending on the country, 5 to 12 times higher than Canada. And the one really striking example I'll give you is that in Europe, in all of these countries have pollution or environmental taxes on the purchase of new motor vehicles based on their fuel consumption. So if you bought a gas guzzler in Norway or the Netherlands that used 12 liters per 100 kilometers or 20 miles per gallon if you're an older person, then in Norway and the Netherlands, you would pay $56,000 as a one-time fee for on top of the price of the vehicle. to reflect the environmental and health damages that your vehicle will cause over time. If you lived in Finland or Portugal, the fee would be a little lower. It would be in and around $21,000. If you lived in the United States, the fee would be $1,700, except for there's a loophole in the American gas guzzler tax that makes it not apply to SUVs, minivans, or pickup trucks. But if you lived in Canada, you wouldn't pay anything at all because our gas guzzler tax doesn't kick in until you get up to an even higher level of fuel consumption, which there are very few vehicles left on the market today that consume the level of fuel required to kick in Canada's green levy. So this is another area where, you know, KPMG, which is a big global accounting firm, did a comparison of all the, they not only looked at 20 different wealthy industrialized countries and their rates of environmental taxation, but they also looked at countries like China and South Africa, and they found that Canada not only finished dead last amongst the wealthy industrialized countries in using green taxes, but we've fallen behind countries like China and South Africa. So at this point, I've painted a pretty scary picture of the situation in Canada, and I guess the best way to think of it is like a Hollywood movie where the aliens have invaded, they've taken over Earth, and things look really bleak. We don't know if the good guys are going to be able to get rid of these alien invaders. So the good news is that to all of these problems that I've been discussing this afternoon, there are solutions. And in fact, one of the most hopeful things about environmental impacts on human health is that the vast majority of them are preventable. And so what do we need to do as a country to move forward? Well, this is what I talk about in part 3 of the book, the prescription. First of all, we need to have a national environmental health action plan like every other major industrialized country has. And that plan should set objectives for where we want to get to. It should have discrete targets and timelines for getting there. It should lay out a whole host of actions that need to be undertaken. And I'll talk about some of those things. So this is a photograph. You probably can't see it that well, but this is from London in 1952. An episode of smog so severe that it killed between 8,000 and 12,000 people. And then this is London today. London, because of that air pollution episode in 1952, England was the first place in the world to pass a Clean Air Act. And so over the ensuing 60 years, the level of particulate matter in the air in London, England, has dropped by over 99% as a result of strong regulation. It's still not perfect, but they've made tremendous progress. None of you are old enough to remember this, but back in the 1960s, headlines talked about lakes that were dying from acid rain and rivers that literally caught on fire. So this is the Cuyahoga River in, just outside Cleveland in Ohio. Caught on fire 3 times during the 1960s because there was so much hydrocarbon pollution in the river that it could actually combust. They just had a celebration last year where this is a fireboat pumping water to celebrate the fact that the Cuyahoga River no longer catches on fire. In terms of pollution taxes, the book talks a lot about what Canada could be doing. If we simply raised the level of pollution tax in Canada to the average in the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, that would generate over $8 billion a year. If we met the average of the European Union, that would generate $20 billion a year in revenue. There's only 2 provinces that have any pollution taxes on industrial pollution at all, British Columbia and Nova Scotia. So it's not a level playing field, and I think that governments in Alberta, Saskatchewan, Ontario, Quebec, it's an easy way to raise money because everyone from Preston Manning to David Suzuki agrees that polluters should pay, and the easiest way to make them do so is to impose a tax on their emissions. Here's another example of how taxes and regulations can work together. Again, many of you will not be familiar with the kind of existential crisis that the human society underwent in the 1970s and 80s when scientists discovered that a few different industrial chemicals were actually eroding the Earth's ozone layer, a vital layer up in the stratosphere that filters out the majority of the sun's ultraviolet radiation. In the 1980s, an international agreement was negotiated, and then additional protocols were negotiated, including the famous Montreal Protocol, which have led to the reduction of chlorofluorocarbons, CFCs, by over 99% since the 1980s. And the Earth's ozone layer is now well on its way to healing by mid-century. We need to just flat out get rid of some of these toxic chemicals, and there's good news there as well, both at the national and at the international level, pursuant to the Stockholm Convention on Persistent Organic Pollutants. About 24 of the most toxic substances ever invented by humans have been completely phased out around the world. As you can see, this chart shows dropping levels of toxic chemicals into breast milk of Swedish women. The blue line is PCBs, the red line is metabolites of DDT. The green line shows a dramatic increase. That's because we started using these chemicals called polybrominated diphenyl ethers as flame retardants back in the 1960s, and then the use of them took off. Sweden was the first country in the world to ban the use of PBDEs, and so that green line immediately thereafter started dropping down like that. But there are many other substances. So, lead is an example of an extremely potent neurotoxin that as recently as 25 years ago, we still allowed lead in gasoline, lead in paints, and those regulations have been changed to eliminate the use of lead. And if I was to take a blood sample from anyone in this room, the level of lead in your blood would be down over 90% from where it would have been in 1980. We also need to change our laws and regulations in Canada to address those environmental injustices that I mentioned earlier. There's not a single law or regulation in Canada that's specifically oriented towards addressing environmental injustice. We need to change environmental assessment regulations, for example, so that consideration of disproportionate impacts is a part of every environmental assessment. And in the United States, they're doing that as part of laws in almost every state and at the federal level. And we also need to increase our investment in these environmental health problems. Canada spends about 10% of what they spend in the United States on research into environmental health. And we also don't do a very good job of educating Canadians about these issues. One of the big game changers, so the book contains a chapter that identifies short-term actions that Canadian governments could take if they were genuinely concerned about protecting our health from these environmental hazards. And then there's also a chapter of longer-term policy prescriptions. And one of the big game changers there is something I've been working on for about 10 years, which is recognition of the human right to live in a healthy environment. It's a human right that is late joining the spectrum of human rights. It was first mentioned in 1972 in the Stockholm Declaration, which came out of the first Global Environmental Summit. But it's taken the world by storm in the 40 years since that happened. And now 181 of the UN's 193 member nations recognize and acknowledge that their citizens have the right to live in a healthy environment, either through signing regional human rights treaties that include the right, or putting it in their national environmental legislation, or most importantly, 100 countries now have the right to a healthy environment written into their constitution, their highest and most powerful laws, and also a reflection of their deepest and most cherished values. So there's never been a human right that's gained such widespread recognition in such a short period of time. And my research on what happens after you constitutionalize the right to a healthy environment is that it's a catalyst for stronger environmental laws, better enforcement of those laws, and an unprecedented role for people in environmental decision making, and most importantly, improved environmental performance. So I've written a couple books on the right to a healthy environment. If people are interested, grab them from the library. I want to spend just 5 minutes talking about my other new book, which is not an academic book. It's called The Optimistic Environmentalist. And let me start off with a survey here. How many people kind of get tired of hearing bad news about the environment? Yeah, so the vast majority of people. So this book is written for you. It's meant as an antidote to ecological doom and gloom. And I wrote this book again because of my daughter who, when she was 7, came to me and she said, I've been learning about global warming at school, Papa, and it's really upsetting to learn that humans are melting the Arctic and polar bears aren't going to have a place to live and creatures might even go extinct. So that was, again, Meredith was the catalyst for this book as well. And I just want to share a couple of stories with you. The first is from the field of renewable energy, because climate change is probably the most significant environmental problem facing humanity today. And renewable energy is an enormous part of the solution. And there's tremendous good news in terms of the accelerating pace of implementation of renewable technologies, far beyond what I had imagined when I started writing this book. So this is a graph that just shows why this is happening. It's not because everyone's becoming a raving Greenpeacer overnight. It's because the cost of a solar panel in terms of dollars per watt has fallen from the 1970s when it was over $75 a watt to today when it's less than 75 cents a watt. Just an unbelievable decline in the cost of solar electricity. And so in countries like Germany, thanks to a government subsidy program that started about 15 years ago, there are cities where almost every building has solar panels on the roof. This is a new, well, 4 years old now, but a new technology that's being used in Spain and the southern United States, where these aren't solar panels, these are actually mirrors that reflect the sunlight back onto that central tower, and that superheats water, which boils, generates steam, which turns turbines. But the really dynamic thing about this kind of technology is that they're storing some of the heat that's generated during the day when the sun shines, and then they store it in these vast tubs of molten salt that are buried underground. And then when the sun goes down, they extract the heat from those from that reservoir of underground, and they can generate electricity 24 hours a day. So it gets rid of the problem of intermittency, which plagues both the sun and the wind. And just to explain to you how fast solar is growing in the world, this is another thing that really blew my mind, quite literally. In the year 2000, as a world, we had 1 gigawatt of installed solar electricity generating capacity. A gigawatt is about 1 billion watts, so it's a lot of energy. It would power about 250,000 homes in Saskatchewan. So globally, that's not that much. The International Energy Agency, or the IEA, which is the world's most preeminent energy forecasting organization, said that if we get the right policies in place, and if we get the degree of investment we need, we could actually have 7 times that much solar energy by the year 2020. They thought that was kind of a big and audacious, bold projection. In fact, today, right now, we're adding 7 gigawatts of solar electrical generating capacity to the grid globally every 6 weeks. So what the IEA thought we'd have for the world as a whole in 2020, we add every 6 weeks. And if I was to put on the third bar on this chart for where we're at in 2015, I'd need a really, really tall ladder, because we just passed 200 gigawatts of installed capacity this summer. And by 2020, when the IEA thought we would have 7, at current rates of growth, we'll have 500. And at current rates of growth, if that continues to the year 2030, then solar will be the #1 source of electricity on the planet. That's a mind-blowing rate of change. And in fact, even people like the IEA don't get it yet. And that's because the human brain cannot grasp exponential growth. If I take a sheet of paper and I fold it in half, it's doubled in thickness, right? If I fold it in half again, it's 4 times as thick. If I fold it again, 8 times as thick. That's what solar's been doing. It's been doubling every 30 months since 1995. If I was to fold this paper in half 51 times, how thick do you think it would be? Like that thick, maybe that thick? The answer is actually this 0.1 millimeter piece of paper doubled 51 times would reach to the sun. 150 million kilometers. I told that to a friend of mine who's a retired professor emeritus at the University of British Columbia, and he said, "David, you're terrible at math." And he went home and he built an Excel spreadsheet because he didn't believe me, and he emailed me the next day and he said, "I'm sorry for insulting your mathematic ability, but you're quite bang on." The other story I wanted to tell you is about the recovery of biological diversity in the temperate parts of the world. So I live on Pender Island on the west coast of British Columbia. Sea otters are one of the most charismatic and cute animals in the world. My daughter's Meredith, it's her #2 favorite after polar bears. In 1929, the last sea otter on the west coast was killed. After 2 centuries of a ferocious fur hunting frenzy, that was the end. There were no more on the coast of the Washington, Oregon, or California. There were no more on the coast of British Columbia. There were still some up in Alaska. And in 1969, Canada imported 89 sea otters from Alaska in an attempt to kickstart the population and to try and reboot it. Those 89 sea otters have lived long and prospered. William Shatner would be proud. And they have spread up and down the coast of Vancouver Island, now moving onto the central coast of British Columbia. There are thousands and thousands of sea otters on the coast. It's a really encouraging story of what happens when we stop killing another species. As I said, I live on Pender Island, and just in the last 3 years, we've started to see the return of these Pacific white-sided dolphins, a super gregarious creature that haven't been seen in the Salish Sea for over a century. They're coming back, and not just in kind of dribs and drabs, but in what are called superpods. Congregations of more than 1,000 dolphins that actually make the ocean look like it's boiling for as far as the eye can see. And these, again, I'm not just cherry-picking species. Northern elephant seal in the upper left, harbor seal, stellar sea lions, fin whales, all of these species are enjoying humongous, tremendous recoveries. The northern elephant seal, just to put some more numbers on it, was hunted until there were less than 100 of them left on the entire Pacific coast of North America. And in 1922, Mexico created a marine sanctuary on Guadalupe Island. And today, There are more than 100,000 northern elephant seals swimming in the waters off of Mexico, the US, and Canada. Humpback whales were hunted, again, to the brink of extinction. They've now they've rebounded from fewer than 10,000 individuals globally to more than 80,000. And again, in the last 5 years, starting to see them off the coast of Pender Island. Really just amazing to see these kinds of creatures coming back. I was out in, and it's not just marine mammals either. I was out in my kayak this summer, and a bald eagle dove from a snag on a Douglas fir tree, dove into the ocean, and then bobbed around there. And I started thinking, am I going to have to rescue this bald eagle? And I thought, how would I do it? Would I like extend my kayak paddle out, kind of lift it up like that? It bobbed around for what seemed like a long time, and then it started doing the bald eagle butterfly stroke, using its wings like this to swim through the water. And it swam back to this island and hopped up onto the rock, and it had a salmon about that big in its talons, which clearly it couldn't achieve liftoff. But bald eagles were reduced to less than 400 nesting pairs in the United States because of the reckless use of DDT in the 1950s and 1960s. Really, that's a very small number for an animal, and they were in severe jeopardy. Regulations were passed ending the use of DDT, and bald eagle populations have recovered. There are now more than 10,000 nesting pairs of bald eagles in the United States. And just north of Vancouver, if you go and visit a place called Brackendale along the banks of the Squamish River, you can actually see when the chum salmon are running in January, you can see more than 1,000 bald eagles in a single day. They're just everywhere. Peregrine falcons, similarly, pushed to the brink of extinction by the reckless use of pesticides. This bird is the fastest animal in the world, capable of speeds of up to 430 kilometers per hour. You really don't want to be a pigeon when there's a peregrine around. And they have, again, recovered so that, in fact, one of the other hats I wear is co-chair of the City of Vancouver's Greenest City Initiative. And at our very first meeting of about 20 environmental experts, it was back in 2009, we were in a downtown Vancouver boardroom, and we had just done our introductions, and we were going around saying, you know, what's everyone's vision of what the greenest city would look like? And this bird went past the window and then did a 180 and came back and landed on the railing. It was a peregrine falcon, man. It was like the most perfect kind of inspiration for the work we're doing in Vancouver. And so, yeah, peregrine falcons. And again, I haven't just cherry-picked species here. A recent study done by the Center for Biological Diversity in the US found that 90% of the species listed under the US Endangered Species Act are on track to meet their scientifically determined recovery targets. Yeah, show me another government program that's achieving a 90% success rate. And this is just I think this is the last animal picture I have. This is a gray whale. And again, gray whales were hunted to the brink of extinction. But 10 years ago, my wife and I went on a kayaking trip in Baja, California. And off the Pacific coast at a little fishing village named Puerto Lopez Mateos, you can go out in a little fisherman's boat. It's about a 7-minute putt-putt thing from the shore. And then the fisherman turns off the engine. And gray whale calves that have just been born, gray whales return to Magdalena Bay to give birth to their calves because there's such a high saline content in the water that the calves float to the surface after they're born. And these calves will swim up to the boat and look at you with their big eye and just kind of, it's impossible to explain the feeling of that kind of communion with another species, especially considering the fact that Magdalena Bay was one of the worst whaling stations in the world. They killed literally thousands of gray whales there over the course of more than a century of whaling. And now these gray whales, their innate curiosity just leads them to come up and check out these odd creatures in the boat. They have recovered to global populations that have led to their removal from the US endangered species list. So if we stop killing species, we stop poisoning them, and we set aside habitat for them to flourish, then they're capable of quite stirring recovery stories. So over the course of the past century, countries around the world have set aside in national parks, ecological reserves, wildlife sanctuaries, etc., more than 25 million square kilometers of wildlife habitat, an area equal to the size of North America. That's still only about 15% of the world's land mass. That means one species is taking priority over the other 85%, but it's a good step in the right direction. So thank you for your time, and I welcome your questions this afternoon. Oh, yeah, look at that. Yes. Yeah, I don't think there's a right or a wrong answer to that question. I think that given where Canada is relative to other countries, there's a tremendous amount of work to be done. And I think that when Canadians learn about how far we are behind in terms of protecting our health from these environmental hazards, that there will be quite a movement in the years ahead once we get rid of the Harper government to actually catch up with some of these other countries. But I would also say, so I think, there's opportunities in politics, in government, in the private sector. It's not going to be one sector of society that moves us forward. It's going to be all sectors of society working together. And I also think that things like the statistics that I was talking about in terms of solar energy mean that there is just incredible work to be done. Saskatchewan is one of the sunniest places, not only in Canada, but in North America, with hours of sunlight that are comparable to Los Angeles and Miami. The solar potential in this province is off the charts. And yet the largest solar array in Saskatchewan to date is at the Nipawin Bible College. It's 400 panels, 100 kilowatts. So 400 panels. The biggest solar utility in the United States is in Southern California, the Topaz Solar Farm, 9 million solar panels. So there's a ways to grow here in Saskatchewan. And I think that, whether you're in law or engineering or whatever you're in, I think that entering that field of solutions, tremendously exciting. And there's actually, I'm not trying to sell books, but if you read The Optimistic Environmentalist, you'll learn that there's incredible opportunities in a whole range of not just renewable energy, but things like shifting our whole economic system from what it currently has been since the Industrial Revolution, a linear economy where we dig up resources, make stuff, and then chuck stuff out at the end, generating waste and pollution at each of those stages. There's now a real movement afoot to move to a circular economy, based on Mother Nature's model, which has had 3.8 billion years of practice, and where waste equals food. And so this concept of a circular economy is gaining traction. There's 2,500 different products, consumer products, that have been certified by the Cradle to Cradle Products Institute because they have designed toxic substances out of the production process and are now, those products can either be composted at the end of their useful life or they can be reused and remanufactured. So that's just a circular process. The most recent product to be certified is actually a solar panel. So these things are starting to converge in a way that makes the future potentially very bright. Other questions? Yes, right in the back there. Yes. Okay, so this question is about a case that's was actually filed in the year 2010 by 2 members of the Aamjiwnaang First Nation who live in the community which has the worst air pollution in Canada. And their legal argument is that a permit granted to Suncor, which allows Suncor to produce more pollution from one of their refineries, that government of action of granting that permit violates their right to under Section 7 of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, the right to life, liberty, and security of the person. That case has been bogged down in preliminary wrangling, evidentiary back and forth, cross-examination, that sort of thing, for 5 years. And in terms of the actual legal argument, whether there's an implicit right to a healthy environment in the right to life, liberty, and security of the person, that legal argument has already been addressed by 22 countries, courts in 22 countries around the world. And in 20 of those cases, the Supreme or Constitutional Courts agreed with the plaintiffs or the applicants that there is an implicit right to a healthy environment in the right to life, liberty, and security of the person. In Germany and the United States, those are the 2 outliers. Courts in those 2 countries have gone the other way and said there's not an implicit right to a healthy environment. Interestingly, there's 3 different Supreme Court of Canada cases now where the Supreme Court has, in obiter, in passing, referred with approval to the right to a safe or healthy environment. So there's some reasons for optimism in Canada in terms of where that case might end up. And there are other Section 7 cases now making their way through the court system as well. Yes?
What's your opinion on the NDP's proposed cap and trade program? What effect does that have on federal regulation?
Okay, so the Federal New Democratic Party, as part of their environmental platform, is proposing a cap and trade system to try and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Cap and trade systems have been successful in some in some applications. So for example, in the 1990 amendments to the US Clean Air Act, created a cap and trade system for sulfur dioxide and nitrogen oxides, which are components of acid rain and also problematic for human health. And that cap and trade system in the United States under the Clean Air Act achieved dramatic reductions in those pollutants at a quite a low economic cost. The NDP's cap and trade proposal, the details are not well known. It would be a much more complicated kind of regulatory framework because there are, compared to SO2 and NOx, there are many, many more sources of greenhouse gas emissions. And a cap and trade program, as proposed by the NDP, would just cover industrial sources of greenhouse gas emissions. So it wouldn't cover transportation or residential related emissions. So it would actually only cover half of Canada's greenhouse gas emission inventory. I personally think that a carbon tax, such as the one we've had in British Columbia for close to a decade, is probably going to be, over the long term, a much easier regulatory approach and can be equally effective if we get the price right. But I will say that a cap and trade system is better than nothing, which is what we currently have. Well, most of those pesticides are still being used in the US as well, but I'll give you one example, atrazine. There's all kinds of studies which atrazine is one of the most frequently used pesticides in Canada. It's used on corn, it's used on soybeans, which are two of the largest agricultural crops because they provide feed for livestock. The research on atrazine will actually put shivers down your spine because American researchers have found that exposure to atrazine at very low levels, low exposures, can transform male frogs into females or give them hermaphroditic sexual characteristics. And that's why the European Union has said we don't believe that atrazine can be used safely. So these chemicals, these are not just obscure chemicals that, you know, maybe lying around in someone's basement. These are chemicals that are among the leading agricultural pesticides in Canada today. Equity of protection for non-human species. Yeah, I mean, this is a problem. You know, it's certainly in countries like the United States that has a strong Endangered Species Act, it's the cute, fuzzy, what they call charismatic megafauna that get the lion's share of both the regulatory attention and the financial resources. But that's starting to change. So, you know, if I don't have my whole list of species that have been removed from the American Endangered Species Act, but it includes the American alligator, not really cute and cuddly. It includes the Lake Erie water snake. It includes several other reptiles. It includes obscure flowers like the Tennessee purple coneflower. So, you know, if you have strong enough laws and regulations in place, then they'll lift up the non-charismatic with the charismatic. But in Canada, I mean, I didn't talk about our endangered species law in Canada. It's just absolutely absurd how weak it is. And even though it's extremely weak, for example, habitat is only protected in Canada on federal lands. And those of you who have studied the Canadian Constitution know that federal lands basically consists of national parks, airports, military bases, reserves, post offices. That's not really a lot of protection for endangered species. Also, water bodies because of the federal government's jurisdiction over fisheries and migratory birds. But in comparison to the United States, their Endangered Species Act applies everywhere. It applies on federal land, on state land, and it applies in full force on private land. So something has to be done there because you can't